This video production of a town called Ironwood was supported by the Arts Foundation of Michigan in conjunction with the Michigan Council for the Arts and Cultural Affairs. In the beginning, this harsh and hostile land was known as Chipaway, the name given to this large peninsula by French explorers in the mid-17th century. The Montreal River, now the dividing line between the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and the state of Wisconsin, was on the earliest of maps from the French explorers dating back to 1649. In 1839, the state of Michigan was in a bitter dispute over its southern border. Michigan was to include as part of its territory the town of Toledo. In a ruling by the United States Congress, Michigan was forced to concede this southern territory, giving Toledo to Ohio. Michigan received as compensation the whole of the Upper Peninsula, considered by most as useless and worthless. It would be another 60 years before the state of Michigan would recognize the Upper Peninsula as an industrial power, producing more iron and copper than anywhere in the world. By the mid-1800s, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan was a haven for prospectors and explorers. Towns were literally formed overnight from small prospecting camps. Marquette, Menominee, Houghton, Hancock, Calumet, all were formed and prospered because of the rich geological formations of iron and copper. But the western end of the Upper Peninsula, the Agogibic region, was relatively untouched and unexplored. It was still considered by land surveyors as having little value and virtually impassable. In 1871, Raphael Pumpelly, a Harvard geology professor, was about to change the way people considered the land of the Gogibic. He was a man of genteel speech and manners. Raphael Pumpelly was born of a wealthy family, one of the first trained mining engineers in the country. Pumpelly quickly became discouraged with teaching at Harvard University. Reading of the possibility of iron deposits in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Pumpelly secured investment money from several wealthy Boston businessmen. He arrived in Marquette, Michigan in the summer of 1871. By boat, he traveled to Bayfield, Wisconsin, where he secured a party of Indian guides, woodsmen, and several canoes. His party traveled east along the shore of Lake Superior to the mouth of the Montreal River. Pumpelly himself seemed out of place within his party, given to expensive clothing, wearing protective gloves, and carrying with him on his explorations such anomalies as his wife. The party would move south along the Montreal and make camp along the bank of the river in what is now known as the town of Ironwood. In the fall of 1871, Pumpelly and several of his party would explore east of the Montreal River, reaching as far as Lake Gogibic, some 25 miles from his camp. On his return, Pumpelly would notice smoke on the horizon. Fearing for his base camp and his wife, Pumpelly and his party climbed a hill for a high ground view. At that time, in October of 1871, Chicago, Illinois, Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and several thousand acres of Wisconsin forest were all burning. Pumpelly noticed large rock formations, and in particular, yellow spots. Pumpelly wrote, "I knew they probably had no important significance, but there was a remote possibility that they meant a concentration of iron oxide." Pumpelly had received orders from his Boston partners to purchase no more options. And although personally Pumpelly didn't think much of his discovery, he returned to Marquette and, going against orders, purchased options on the land of his discovery. The hill he purchased would later become the third largest producer of iron ore on the Gogebic Range. It would be called Newport, named after Pumpelly's hometown. Although explorations came before and after Pumpelly, it would be another 10 years before the true value of the Gogebic Range would be discovered. As part of a deal struck with the state of Michigan, the Keweenaw Canal Company received some 20,000 acres of land as payment for building the canal that cuts through the Keweenaw Peninsula. These 20,000 acres were located on the Gogebic and Menominee Ranges. The land agent for the Keweenaw Canal Company was John Monroe Longyear. In the winter of 1881, John Longyear, a prospector and explorer himself, received a letter from the president of the Keweenaw Canal Company, Theodore M. Davis.
Dear Mr. Longyear, I would like you to take a young man under your charge. For the past 5 years he has been a teller at the Bank of London. He is the son of our vice president and wishes to be in business in the United States. I would appreciate if you would make an explorer out of him. Theodore M. Davis.
John Monroe Longyear wrote, "I have no interest or ability in being a teacher." Theodore Davis approached John Longyear with another letter.
There will be no specific results required of you. The young man's father simply does not know what to do with him. It was at my suggestion that he be sent out to develop himself as a man, and perhaps find some iron mines. The exploration will be funded with $25,000, which I will send to you, and I will take full responsibility for the results.
Longyear consented to undertake the enterprise, and in February of 1881, the young man named in the letter, Alexander Lanphier Norrie, arrived in Marquette, Michigan. Longyear was to write of Norrie that he was a tall, round-shouldered young fellow of huge frame and good manners. He was good-natured and became fairly popular with the young people. Longyear would not pass a great opportunity. He employed for Norrie an assistant who was well posted in the business of exploring for iron ore. This was one of 5 brothers who were all competent and trustworthy prospectors, James R. Wood, who would also be known as Iron Wood. James R. Wood and Alexander Lanphier Norrie would explore together for the next 2 years. During the summer of 1881 and the winter of 1882, Wood and Norrie would explore the Menominee region of the Upper Peninsula without any great results. In the spring of 1882, Norrie requested to undertake exploration of the region known as the Gogebic on the far western end of the Upper Peninsula. Norrie and Wood established base camp along the eastern side of the Montreal River, at first just a lean-to, then later a log camp. In August of that year, John Longyear would visit the camp of Norrie and Wood. On the 1st of September 1882, Norrie and Longyear would leave camp to explore the eastern end of the Gogebic, leaving Wood to explore the relatively close vicinity of the camp. One day later, on September 2nd, 1882, Wood discovered a small deposit of hematite ore on the southwest corner of Section 22, not more than 400 yards southeast of their base camp. A test pit was dug, and it was concluded that the ore was not enough to encourage a deeper dig. The first discovery was abandoned. Wood and Norrie continued to explore the section, and on the northeast corner of Section 22, more hematite ore was found. Wood calculated this deposit was immense, and this mine would yield a huge deposit of iron ore, much more than his first discovery. Wood's calculations were correct. The Norrie mine, as it was later called, would become in a few short years the largest producer of iron ore in the world. Over the next year, James Wood was responsible for the discoveries of the North Norrie, the East Norrie, and the Aurora mines.
Norrie was somebody that was extremely lucky to have somebody like James Wood on board as a surveyor and as a prospector, okay? I think Norrie was wise enough to shut up and let this man do his job. I think Norrie was a person who basically has been overestimated as, you know, as an investor in the area or something like that. He came from a moneyed family, okay, and he had some background as a bank clerk in his father's bank, okay, and the father really didn't want him around as a deadbeat anymore because he wasn't really accomplishing much in that field. So he invested $25,000 in getting him off his off his hands, and that's when he came over into this area to do explorations. James Wood is the one that really needs to be accredited, you know, for finding the Norrie Formation, okay? Knew when to really give up. They were first prospecting on the Ashland, what became known as the Ashland property, which was the mine that was closest to the Wisconsin border over here. And weren't finding a lot of ore, weren't finding much of anything in the beginning. So Wood was smart enough to get off that property immediately. And they began setting up camp on what became the Norrie property later on. But, I mean, this is the man that invested the money. This is the guy that was in charge. That's why the mine became the Norrie mine. But in my definition, and I'm biased, it probably should have been known as the Wood mine because he's the man that did most of the discovering and the prospecting.
Wood became captain of the Norrie mine until late 1885, when he would once again move to do what he did best, prospect in Texas and Arizona. James Wood died while prospecting in Texas on February 8, 1914, at the age of 65. He is buried next to his brother John in Appleton, Wisconsin. By late 1883, Alexander Lanphier Norrie would leave the Gogebic for his hometown of New York City, leaving James Wood and John Longyear to run his properties. In 1886, Norrie sold his options to the Metropolitan Land and Iron Company. Norrie, in a sharp business move, would receive a commission for the ore produced from these iron mines for a period of 10 years, making him a fortune for his brief time on the Gogebic. Norrie would visit Ironwood once a year until 1892. Alexander Lanphier Norrie died in New York City in 1910. John Monroe Longyear would accumulate wealth on the Gogebic, taking out land options for himself and his Boston business partner, Frederick Ayer. Realizing the potential for the development of these Gogebic communities, Longyear would purchase huge tracts of land to be sold for timber as well as housing lots. In 1908, John Monroe Longyear would have his entire mansion in Marquette, Michigan, made of Lake Superior stone, moved piece by piece to Brookline, Massachusetts, where he died in 1922. By 1883, this prospecting village was nothing more than a few tents and log camps. It was situated in the midst of a vast, dense forest, still considered by most to be impassable and unforgiving. But word of great iron ore finds was spreading throughout the country. In that same year, two brothers from Ashland, Wisconsin, J. and Everest Hayes, purchased options on the land of the first dig of Norrie and Wood in Section 22, the dig that was abandoned the previous year. How they purchased this property is just as unusual and unlikely as the little village itself. Mary Folsom Hayes, the mother of J. and Everest, was said to have the power. A spiritual revelation at the age of 27 left her speaking in tongues. As she put it, she began to speak French, German, and Polish, although she had no formal training in any foreign language. She felt compelled to preach, heal the sick, and follow the direction of the power. The power, she said, directed her to call on people or go to places without any notion of why she was needed. The power would inevitably lead her to find someone who was ailing, whom she helped with simple tonics, or she would sometimes lay her hands on the patient, relieving them of pain or fever, according to reports. In December of 1882, the power directed Mary to tell her sons to invest in land with a vast underdeveloped deposit of iron ore. Her sons, Everest and Jay, now attorneys in Ashland, had come to respect their mother's power. With the help of Mary's friend, Nat Moore from Bessemer, the brothers invested all the money saved from their law practice to purchase options on land surrounding the first test pit. This area was not considered worth the investment of further exploration. Mary Folsom Hayes would later say, "The Power distinctly stated that the Ashland mine was intended for her and her family and their descendants, and that out of it would come all the money that they would ever need." The original test pit of Norrie and Wood was 32 feet deep. The Hayes brothers drove the test pit to the depth of 46 feet, where they found a huge vein of iron ore. The Ashland mine was to produce more than 8 million tons of iron ore before it closed in 1926. By October of 1884, exploration on the Gogebic Range intensified. The Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western Railway entered the southwestern part of Ontonagon County. Iron ore was shipped first from the Colby mine in Bessemer. The iron ore had to be transported in small quantities by mule and wagon east to the railhead in Watersmeet, some 30 miles away. The small mining village founded by Wood and Norrie had a population of no more than 100. But crude construction was underway, anticipating growth, and the railroad. The isolated area of the Gogebic was still dense with forest and brush, but within a few short months, the railroad would change the face of the Gogebic forever. The railhead located at Watersmeet was first designed to join the copper country of the Keweenaw Peninsula with the port of Milwaukee. The shipments of ore from the Colby and rumors of great deposits of iron ore were enough to alter the direction of the railroad. Realizing the potential of the Gogebic Range, the president of the Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western, W.F. Rhinelander, ordered his railroad west into the Gogebic. Driven at a tremendous pace, the railway from Watersmeet, Michigan to Ashland, Wisconsin was completed by year's end. In the spring of 1885, the Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western platted the town site of this unnamed village. On board the train was W.F. Rhinelander. A discussion arose as to the name of the village, Rhinelander taking suggestions from those at his side. He asked to see the man in charge of the mining operations in the village. Rhinelander was told it was James Iron Wood. James Wood arrived, shook hands, and Rhinelander christened the town Ironwood. The Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western opted for Ashland, Wisconsin as a port over other southern established ports. The geographical location is lower than the Gogebic Range, making hauling huge amounts of iron ore virtually downhill.
It would be extremely difficult to state and get a full understanding just how important the trains and the railroads were to this area. Without the arrival of the railroads and the trains that came in with the railroads, there would have been virtually no development of any communities or any towns on the range. It was absolutely essential to have the railroads first, and then the communities followed in afterwards. As a matter of fact, when the railroads arrived in any given area on the Gogebic Range, it was almost a mushroom effect. They just sort of grew up overnight. So that's how important they were. They not only took the ore out, they not only brought goods in, they also brought everything else in, culture, anything that was a facet of recognized civilization was brought to this area because of the railroads.
But iron ore is not the only thing the trains would carry, and by the end of 1885, the boom was on. In 1885, the growth of ironwood was nothing short of spectacular. The mines that had been nothing more than large pits a year before were sinking vertical shafts, and began shipping iron ore. The Norrie, Aurora, and the Pabst mines were all producing. A tremendous amount of wood was needed for head frames and shoring in the mines. Buildings had to be constructed for businesses and the new citizens of Ironwood. The need for timber created new industries as lumber mills grew out of the wilderness, bringing with them lumbermen from across the Midwest. By year's end, the Gogebic produced a total of 119,000 tons of iron ore, and Ironwood's population had increased from 100 to 1,000. In the spring of 1886, the need for more men increased. The mines were pushing their production to 10 times what it had been the previous year. The town grew rapidly as buildings were being constructed out of the forest. By the end of 1886, the town of Ironwood would have 15 streets and over 35 buildings, mostly businesses and boarding houses. Across the river in Wisconsin, Hurley was keeping pace with Ironwood. The Germania, Carey, and Montreal mines were all shipping ore. John Burton, co-owner of the Pabst and Iron King mines, was in the process of constructing a spectacular hotel, the Burton House, said to be the finest hotel in the Midwest, the hotel of 1,000 windows. It was at this hotel that presidents, congressmen, and other dignitaries from around the world would rest on a visit to the Gogebic Range. The hectic pace at which the Gogebic Range grew was fueled by money. Businessmen started mining companies equipped with only pick and axe, issuing stocks by the millions. By the end of 1886, 187 mining companies were issuing stock. The trading was so frenzied, a special stock exchange was organized in Milwaukee, trading exclusively in Gogebic stocks. The speculation of fortunes to be made on the Gogebic was fueled by newspaper accounts of the ease by which one could find iron ore. Equipped with nothing more than a shovel, one account read, one could make an easy fortune on the Gogebic. But nothing was further from the truth. A mine demanded planning, time, and capital to develop. Hard-working people, upon hearing of the great riches of the Gogebic, coupled with rumors of gold and silver, spent their life savings and mortgaged their homes to purchase stock on the Gogebic Range. These new mining companies would only be able to purchase land far from the actual vein of iron. Most of the iron ore deposits were already in the hands of more established and legitimate companies. In 1887, while the established mines were producing more iron ore than ever, the other so-called new mining companies were declaring bankruptcy by the dozen. Investors who envisioned easy wealth were heavily in mortgage debt and left holding worthless stock certificates. It's estimated that over $150 million of worthless stock was issued, with no one but a select few ever seeing a dime. Even the wealthy were not exempt from speculation fever. John Burton, co-owner of the Pabst, Blue Jacket, Bonney, and Iron King mines, invested heavily into non-producing property. Taking massive losses, he borrowed to invest heavily in real estate in Hurley's downtown district. On June 27, 1887, fire destroyed most of downtown Hurley, leaving the Burton House, but destroying 90% of his property. John Burton declared bankruptcy, selling all his holdings on the Gogebic Range and eventually selling the Burton House for 1 million canceled postage stamps. In the year of 1887, Ironwood had its own difficulties. The steady influx of people caused a shortage of rooms and buildings. Log shacks, tents, and even the dense wood served as home to men and their families who migrated to Ironwood for work. On September 17th of 1887, at approximately 12 noon, a fire broke out in a small upstairs warehouse next to the Alhambra Theater on Ayer Street. The fire was originally small, but the unusually dry year, coupled with tinder-dry wood frame buildings and with no organized fire department, the fire remained unchecked and spread rapidly. Within an hour and a half, the fire burned most of the downtown district, the better part of 6 blocks. While the fire was destroying the city, looters were busy too. The heavily wooded lots behind businesses served as good hiding places for stolen merchandise. People were seen rolling kegs of beer into the woods while saloons burned. Shopkeepers, in an effort to save their merchandise, filled the streets with their goods, only to find them missing on the next trip. The fire had been brought under control by miners who'd been released from work, and the newly formed Hurley Fire Department, who tore down buildings in the fire's path to remove fuel. By 3 in the afternoon, the fire had run its course, causing over $200,000 worth of damage. Miraculously, no one was injured. For Ironwood, it was a bitter pill to swallow. This new town, full of optimism and looking toward a bright future, was destroyed. It was predicted the city would never recover, but like so many predictions on the range, it turned out to be wrong. Construction began immediately, and by the summer of 1888, Ironwood once again appeared as a thriving, growing community, complete with new brick and stone structures and a new fire department. In 1887, Ironwood was chartered as a township. This move would provide for more autonomy for this rapidly growing community. Meanwhile, Michigan and Wisconsin had entered into a boundary dispute. Michigan, contesting the western border of the Upper Peninsula, claimed it was inaccurately charted and was actually the west branch of the Montreal River, giving Michigan 10 more miles of rich iron ore-producing property. Wisconsin disagreed vehemently. In an ironic twist, the land that no one wanted a decade before now became hotly contested property. The boundary battle raged for years until 1922. The United States Supreme Court declared the boundary of Michigan and Wisconsin to be the east branch of the Montreal, as it was in the past. The growth of Ironwood was relative to its people. Ideas and the most modern inventions were used in the development of the mines in the town. In 1884, the Ashland mine would be the first iron mine in the world to use electricity, supplying power to lights and pumps, allowing for deeper depths. The other mines would quickly follow suit, stepping up production to meet demand. To meet the needs of the expanding population, boarding houses were built close to the mines, supplying needed rooms for the droves of men coming to work on the Gogebic. One newspaper account read, "The beds are never cold, even in winter. When one miner leaves, another takes his place." The mines were labor-intensive. By 1890, the Ashland mine, considered small by Gogebic standards, was employing close to 1,000 men. In 1885, on the christening train of W.F. Rhinelander, came a man who would have a big impact on this little mining town of Ironwood. He was born Solomon S. Curry on June 12, 1839, in Glengarry, Ontario, Canada. At the age of 16, he headed for New York, where he worked as a blacksmith's apprentice. It was said his education stemmed from reading the Encyclopedia Britannica from A to Z. 1885 found Solomon Curry in charge of the Metropolitan Iron and Land Company operations on the Gogebic. The deal struck with A.L. Norrie gave the Metropolitan the Norrie and the Aurora mines, later purchasing the East Norrie and the Pabst. Under Curry's direction, the Metropolitan became the largest iron mining company in the world. Curry's influence within the city was widespread. Building one of the finest homes in Ironwood, complete with ornate imported woodwork, Tiffany-stained glass, servants' quarters, ballroom, and gymnasium. In 1890, Curry would delve into real estate, purchasing large lots, subdividing them for homes, and huge tracts of lands north of the city in the wilderness. On one of these tracts, Curry would put a driving park for automobiles, complete with grandstands and a picnic area for families. Curry later donated this park to the city. It would still later become Gogebic County Fairgrounds. He would become active in state politics, running for lieutenant governor in 1896. He had become president of 2 banks and started a military organization called the Curry Rifles, complete with uniforms and an armory. Solomon S. Curry died in 1929 at the age of 91. He was one of the few mining pioneers who would call this little mining town home. He's buried at Riverside Cemetery in Ironwood. Between the years of 1886 and 1890, Ironwood grew rapidly. Its growth reflected the output of the mines. The Norrie mine itself was producing more than 1 million tons of iron ore a year, making the Norrie the largest producer of iron ore in the world. By 1892, the Metropolitan Iron and Land Company sold its holdings on the Gogebic to the Oliver Mining Company, then half-owned by Andrew Carnegie. By 1897, Carnegie would own all of the Oliver and absorb it into his other company, U.S. Steel. The tremendous influx of immigrants caused Ironwood to make rapid changes in the community. It had grown from a mining town of 100 in 1884 to a thriving boom town of 5,000 in 1887. In 1886, the need for public education was growing, if not obvious. A school district was organized in Ironwood Township, then part of Ontonagon County. A one-room schoolhouse was erected on Vaughan Street. 40 pupils attended using old books, catalogs, and whatever they could get their hands on. Miss Fitzsimmons became the first teacher, and O.H. Karras became the first principal. By the summer of 1887, O.H. Karras had drawn the attention of the students, parents, and the school board. His old ways and unpleasant demeanor did nothing for this beginning school system. He would later say, "I taught with a whip in one hand and a stick in the other." O.H. Karras was fired in the summer of 1887. He would come in July of 1887. A bright, enthusiastic young man from Opaka, Wisconsin, Luther L. Wright, would hold the positions of superintendent, principal, and teacher. By the opening of the school year in 1887, 500 students would enroll. Space for these students was at a premium. The one-room schoolhouse on Vaughan Street would hold no more than 90. The school system rented halls, churches, even saloons and gambling parlors. In 1887, the decision was made to construct a new 3-story schoolhouse, said to be the finest in the Midwest. The first central school was completed in 1888. The school board was severely criticized for building such a huge school at the tremendous cost of $15,000. The central school held 600, but by 1890, 3 more school buildings had to be constructed. In that same year, Ironwood would graduate its first high school class, 3 boys and 2 girls. By 1893, the progressive Ironwood schools inaugurated a new system for teaching the very young children. The Froebel School was constructed, and Ironwood had a kindergarten, the first in the state of Michigan, and one of the first in the nation. Luther L. Wright's brilliance came in the education of the children. His radical ideas left the Ironwood school system a model for other communities to follow for decades. His anti-discriminatory views seeped into his work. He would write, "There are no artificial distinctions in society or in our classrooms. No cliques, no differences. Everyone is just as good as everyone else, and is so recognized." By 1898, Ironwood had 7 school buildings operating and needed more. The total enrollment had grown to 2,240. A gift from John M. Longyear gave Ironwood a large piece of property on East Ayers Strait. The city planned for a beautiful park, but Luther L. Wright had different ideas. He planned his new high school on that very property. A verbal battle was waged, lasting several months. Wright learned that $6,000 had gone missing from school funds and had been redirected to the city's coffers. At a meeting in February of 1889, Wright drew the attention of the city council by disclosing information of this illegal maneuver. By the end of the meeting, Luther L. Wright had his land and his new high school. In 1900, the new Luther L. Wright High School was completed at a cost of $40,000. The school would be equipped with every modern improvement and was considered by most one of the best schools in the country. Realizing the need for education other than academic, Wright spearheaded several projects. In 1903, Ironwood constructed the Domestic Science Building, primarily for young women. In 1908, the Manual Training School was completed, giving young men experience in employable skills. Luther L. Wright's foresight led to one of the first vocational training centers in the nation.
So Luther L. Wright was a tremendous educator. He also brought in young teachers, teachers that had just gone through their training and were cutting their teeth. He would bring them into this, again, this frontier sort of setting where they were really going to have to practice their stuff, but they could also take new methods that they were devising and, in education and try them out here. So he was getting the best teachers, the freshest teachers, the newest teachers, and bringing them into a setting like this. So these mining kids, these loggers kids or whatever, they were really getting some of the best education, that money could buy.
In 1907, after 20 years of service, Luther L. Wright resigned as superintendent of Ironwood's schools. He would move on to Lansing and serve as Michigan's education director. Luther L. Wright died on January 10, 1922, at the age of 65. The development of Ironwood was centered around the mines. The Ashland, Townsite, Norrie, Aurora, Pabst, and Iron King established themselves as viable sources of iron ore and employment. Between the years of 1886 and 1893, the growth of the town was nothing short of meteoric. 1893 saw the Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western Railway bought by the Chicago and Northwestern. It was their promise to build a new depot, one that would make the citizens of Ironwood proud. And they did. The new depot would be the center of activity for the next 80 years. Small communities sprang up by each mine. These small communities, called locations, had their own independent national flavor. Immigrants settled in locations that held their friends and relatives. The French, Poles, and Finns each had a location of their own, usually complete with neighborhood store and saloon. Trains ran into Ironwood, bringing as many as 100 immigrants a day, most uneducated and unable to speak much English. The location became an extension of their homeland. No fewer than 18 head frames could be seen on the landscape where once tall timbers had stood. Ironwood was devoid of trees. Most had been used for mine shoring and structures. The logging and timber industry expanded rapidly as the call for more wood went out. Logging camps were a common sight in the wilderness, and lumber mills prospered, trying to meet the insatiable demand for wood. They first came from the Marquette region, the experienced Irish, British, Cornish, and French-Canadian miners. But these limited sources of manpower were not enough to fill the demand. By 1890, up to 12,000 miners were needed to operate these huge properties of the Gogebic. New sources of labor were needed as demand far exceeded supply. Some came on their own accord. Others were enticed by newspaper ads promising work and wealth. Large contingents of Poles, Italians, and Finns flocked to the new Iron Range and settled in locations. The mining companies themselves sent out agents to recruit labor, paying a commission for every man they brought in. Some were imported from as far away as Mexico. The work was difficult, tedious, and dangerous, and the pay was poor. $1 a day for a 12-hour day. The Copper Country, the Marquette Range, and the Mesabi Range of Minnesota had deep infiltration of unionized labor. On March 4, 1890, the first steps were taken to unionize miners in Ironwood. Over 800 men met at the Pierce Opera House. A vote unanimously approved to proceed with the union. The growing anger of labor was fueled by an economic depression in 1893, putting 60% of labor out of work. Soup kitchens and relief stores were opened as frustration grew. Behind the depression was the falling price of ore. The sporadic openings and closings of the mines dashed hopes of long-term employment. The Nori mine, which had been paying $1.50 a day, would reopen, but with a reduced wage of $1 a day. May 4, 1894, saw the first strike on the Gogebic. 38 trammers walked off the job to protest the $1 a day wage. It had no effect. Other workers replaced those who walked, and the Nori was quickly shipping at full capacity. Mining was on again, off again, but the mines were continuously shipping from huge stockpiles of ore. Strikes were rampant throughout the Midwest. Dock workers in Ashland, Wisconsin struck for higher pay. Non-union workers were sent from the Gogebic and other iron ranges to work the docks under the protection of the United States Marshals. By the third week of June 1894, frustration peaked. The strike came with a vengeance. The walkout began at the Nori, spread quickly to the East Nori, the Aurora, the Pabst, and Newport. By week's end, 3,000 men were on strike. Strikers circulated reports that ore was bringing a much higher price than the company would admit. Solomon Curry, then president of the Metropolitan Iron and Land Company, issued an ultimatum. Either return to work by the 30th of June or collect your final paychecks. At the same time, he offered jobs to any non-union men who would work. On July 3rd, the Metropolitan Iron Company began shipping from stockpiles using non-union labor. Over 1,000 men marched up Suffolk Street to the Nori mine, armed with rocks and clubs. The confrontation was violent as the Union men drove the steam shovel operators away under a barrage of rocks and sticks. Ernest Knight, captain of the Nori mine, retaliated with revolver fire, shooting 2 seriously and wounding 10 in all, dispersing the strikers. The powerful heads of the mining company called upon the governor. On the 4th of July, the state militia was sent into Ironwood. Their presence was met with protest and violence, sending several state militiamen to the hospital. The week of July 9th saw the arrest of Union leaders. The Union was held at bay by the militia, and the mining company would not budge, refusing to increase pay or shorten the workday. Led by Frank Naughton, representative of the American Federation of Labor, and a promise of $3 a week, the miners were equally adamant in their refusal to work. Meetings were set between labor and management with no results. On July 16th, the Nori mine would again ship ore from its stockpiles under the protection of the state militia, standing guard with fixed bayonets. On the 25th of July, on charges of libel brought by the Metropolitan Iron Company, Frank Naughton was arrested. Without leadership, the Union and the movement rapidly fell apart. Slowly, men returned to work, and by August 1st, the strike was dead. The mines resumed production, but with 500 fewer men. Frank Naughton was released from Gogebic County Jail on November 20th, 1894, under threats of false imprisonment. Having been incorporated as a village in 1887, Ironwood, along with other range villages, pushed for separation from Ontonagon County. The new county would be called Gogebic and recognized by the state of Michigan in 1888. The county seat was in dispute, Bessemer claiming the geographic center of the county and Ironwood claiming the most populated. A vote was cast, and once again it thrust the range into controversy. Napoleon D. Massey, prominent businessman from Bessemer, is said to have gone from farm to farm and house to house, bringing voters from Bessemer to the polls. When all votes were cast, Bessemer had won, with more votes cast for Bessemer than the entire population of that town. Ironwood claimed fix, but Bessemer became the county seat. On April 8, 1889, Ironwood was incorporated as a city. The small mining camp of Wood and Nori now had a population of 7,000. Mines were shipping close to 10,000 tons of iron ore a day, and over 120 new buildings were being constructed. The first sewage system was installed, running directly into the Montreal River. Breweries were being built, but unable to keep up with demand. Saloons were many and patrons were plentiful. By 1891, Ironwood had a new city hall, housing the fire department, city offices, and the new municipal library. On September 19, 1891, the maiden voyage of the Gogebic Electric Railway streetcar took place. A trip to Hurley took 5 minutes and cost 5 cents. The streetcar was to provide an important role throughout the range, connecting small town to small town and location to location. The streetcars would have their day and run until 1932. The great iron mines of the Gogebic earned the distinction of the most dangerous mines in the world. Issue after issue of newspapers reported the accidents and deaths of the men who worked the mines. The grim toll continued throughout the history of the Gogebic. The safety of the miners was not high on the company's list of priorities. A mule was considered more valuable. A good mule cost more than a miner's yearly wage. Deep shafts, soft formations, fire, and constantly wet conditions proved to be factors in mining fatalities. Even mine officials were not exempt from the dangers of these mines.
Captain James Roberts was killed at the Red Jacket this week. He was riding on the crosshead of an ascending bucket, and when it reached the surface, he was found with his head smashed, it having been caught by the timbers. Iowa Times, 1890.
By 1910, mine accidents became so frequent, companies were prompted to build hospitals near the mine locations. Even these hospitals were taxed due to the numbers of accidents occurring. By the time the Gogebic region ceased operations, over 1,000 men had lost their lives in the mines, and over 10,000 had been severely injured.
My dear sister Ellen, I hope this letter finds you all well. I, on the other hand, have tragic news. My husband John was killed at the Nori last week. It was my greatest fear, but in some ways it is a relief. I'll not have to pray for his safe return again. The children are rather confused now. I am asking you, Ellen, if you have the means to take care of them for a short time. I will try to find a new husband. Until then, I am without the means to take care of them. Captain Reed came to our home and told me of John's plight. He said he died quickly and was not in pain. I thank God for that. Captain Reed gave me John's death benefit for his loyal service to the company. $23 and a ham. Eva Doucette, 1892.
In the beginning, Ironwood, like the Gogebic Range, took on the appearance of a western town, complete with gun-toting miners, hitching posts, and saloons. From its early days, Ironwood and its Wisconsin neighbor Hurley were considered lawless and godless. Saloons, gambling parlors, and houses of prostitution lined the main streets of both towns. The bawdy times of the late 1800s played host to drunken brawls, gunfights, and stabbings. The solution to a drunken argument was often murder. But murders weren't exclusive of drunken brawls. One of the most notorious murders on the range occurred in Hurley, Wisconsin, April of 1890. Lotta Morgan was one of 200 working girls in Hurley, a 29-year-old prostitute, and as reported in the newspaper, found dead with her head split open with an axe and carrying a bullet. Her funeral was held at the Opera House and was attended by well-established members of the community, clergymen, and fellow working girls. Over 1,000 people attended the service. The murder became legend as plays, books, and articles have been written about it. The character of Lotta Morgan would become immortalized in Edna Ferber's book, Come and Get It. By the early 1900s, the murder rate had not subsided, but even the prosperous mining captains were not free from tragedy. On Monday, January 8, 1908, 53-year-old John Benedetto approached Captain William Thomas of the Aurora mine. Benedetto asked Thomas for work. Thomas expressed sympathy and explained that he had none at the time. Benedetto walked away. He returned, moments later, brandishing a pistol, and fired on Captain Thomas, hitting him twice in the chest. Benedetto ran into the bushes. Captain Thomas was taken to the Union Hospital, where he would die 3 hours later. Benedetto was captured and within a month found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life at Marquette State Prison. In 1923, at the age of 68, Benedetto was paroled and deported to Italy. The most celebrated murder on the Gogebic occurred on August 26, 1889. Reinhard Raymond Holsey would go into the annals of history as the last stagecoach robber east of the Mississippi. At 11 a.m., on Stagecoach Road west of Lake Gogebic, Michigan, Raymond Holsey waved to stop the stage. The 4 passengers aboard were wealthy bankers from Chicago and Minneapolis and had just completed a successful fishing vacation at Lake Gogebic. Raymond Holsey asked for a collection. Daniel McCocker, one of the passengers, assumed he was joking and asked, "How much?" Holsey produced 2 pistols and said, "I'll take $500. McCocker reached into his pocket for his wallet and pulled out a pistol instead, shooting at Holsey and missing. Holsey unloaded both revolvers into the stage, hitting McCocker in the mouth and knee. Another passenger, Adolf Fleshbein, tried to jump from the stage, but was hit twice in the hip. The stage bolted down the dirt road, leaving Fleshbein lying on the ground. Holsey rifled Fleshbein's pockets, taking his Elgin pocket watch and $37. Fleshbein died the next morning. Holsey was at large until the 31st of October. He was arrested in Republic, Michigan, and ordered to stand trial in Gogebic County. Holsey was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life. But Holsey's story doesn't end there. 6 months after his incarceration at Marquette State Prison, Holsey had an altercation with another inmate. Holsey held a knife to the inmate's throat, and the warden shot the knife out of Holsey's hand. Holsey would lose 4 fingers as a result. Holsey was deemed incorrigible and sent to Ionia, a prison in Lower Michigan. It was believed that a bone was pressing on Holsey's brain, causing him to do these dastardly deeds. Holsey underwent surgery to remove this bone. The surgery, affectionately called a skull job, was nothing more than a lobotomy. Raymond Holsey was returned to Marquette, where he became a model prisoner, serving as prison newspaper editor and photographer. After he had served 22 years in prison, Governor Fred Warner commuted Holsey's sentence. In 1911, Holsey was released. Holsey opened a photography studio in Marquette, Michigan, and remained in business several years, later working as a fishing guide near Big Bay. It was said of Holsey that he was a great friend of all children. In 1932, Holsey retired to Captiva Island, Florida, where he would continue to write for local newspapers. Holsey would later admit to friends that he had been haunted by the face of Adolf Fleshbein and would often relive that fateful day in his dreams. On September 24, 1952, at the age of 86, Reinhard Raymond Holsey sat on his back porch in Florida, drew a pistol for the last time, and took his own life. By 1889, the mining companies would flex their political muscle in Ironwood. The infiltration into city politics was deliberate and deemed necessary for control. A list of the first aldermen in the city reads like a who's who of mine officials. The political influences of the mining companies served their purposes. The mines could now limit industry in Ironwood, allowing the mine companies to guard against the intrusion of large industry that would pull away their labor pool, and at the same time, they could keep wages artificially low. Mine politics were calculated to address the issue of labor unrest, of which the mines were acutely aware. Not only would the mines control the professional lives of the miners, but to a degree, their personal lives as well. The mining company was in control, providing for housing, heating fuel, medical, and other essentials. Money was deducted from paychecks to repay the company for these services.
Every single facet of that person's life was affected by the mining management, as to how far your trees were planted, okay, apart from each other on your lawn, as to how the fence in the back, where you either stored waste or if you had a garden, how that was to be arranged, as to what color your house was, as to what color the trim on the house had to be, as to what color your toilet seat had to be. In other words, this is an example. All employees had to have red toilet seats. You could try to paint the damn thing white, but it just bleached through anyway. The only people that could have or apply for white toilet seats were mining captains, mining superintendents, or an owner, if he happened to be in the area. But even that facet of a person's life, something is profoundly private or is as simplistic as a toilet seat, that was even dictated.
By the end of the 19th century, the growth of Ironwood was extraordinary. Businesses flourished as more and more people converged on the town. A housing boom was on, as miners and their families expanded the city and pressed the water and sewage resources to the maximum. Ironwood was forced to make improvements to its structure, building streets, sidewalks, new sewage systems, and new water sources. The turn of the century brought new changes, and once again, the miners were on the verge of Union rebellion.
A committee of miners at the 3 Nori mines in this city have made a request to the company for shorter hours or increased pay. They called upon Mine Superintendent McLean to give the men an 8-hour day. They said they were perfectly satisfied with the treatment they'd received, but considered the working hours too long. Mr. McLean informed them it would be impossible to grant their request, explaining the reasons. The men left in the best of spirits and expressed they were much pleased with the courteous treatment they'd received. Ironwood Times, 1899.
Several months later, as labor gradually became more organized, Oliver Mining Company, the pace setter on the Gogebic Range, in an effort to avert a union walkout, increased workers' pay to $2.25 a day. 1901 saw the establishment of Ironwood's first official police force, consisting of 4 men. By 1925, the force would grow to over 35, complete with police cars. The fire department consistently updated fire equipment and employed a second station in Jesseville. By 1905, the lumber and timber industry were exploding. The Scott and Howe lumber yard was now working 24 hours, producing 75,000 board feet a day, still falling short of demand. The population of the city was increasing, and property was a valuable commodity. By 1910, Ironwood's population hit 12,000 and was still growing. The birth rate was on the rise. 1 child was being born every day. Now, second generations would live in Ironwood. Under pressure from the Union and the high demand for iron ore, 1912 saw the Oliver Mining Company reduce its workday to 8 hours, hiring 30% more labor to keep up with demand. In 1915, the buildup prior to World War I was massive. The insatiable need for steel had the iron mines of the Gogebic running at full capacity. A strike on the Mesabi Iron Range in Minnesota left the Gogebic holding the load of production, pushing the iron mines deeper, demanding more ore. By 1922, World War I was long over, but the prosperity continued. The need for iron ore was still increasing. Now, sons were working in the mines alongside their fathers, producing double and sometimes triple family incomes. The population of Ironwood doubled since 1910, and work was plentiful. The mines supplied employment for every able-bodied man who wanted work. In 1925, the population of Ironwood would climb to an all-time high of 25,000 people, making Ironwood the largest city in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, surpassing Menominee, Houghton, and Marquette. The value of mining properties in Ironwood alone exceeded $18 million. Coupled with the homes of residents, this gave Ironwood the necessary funds to build. New sewer and water systems were built. Streets were paved. Electric streetlights were installed, and the viaduct was built. The viaduct, connecting North and South Ironwood, was built to accommodate growing automobile traffic across the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad tracks. The new municipal building was constructed at a cost of $400,000, housing the city offices, gymnasium, auditorium, and pool. The old Luther L. Wright High School had become severely overcrowded. By 1925, Ironwood had 4,900 students in its school system. Dedicated February 4, 1926, the new Luther L. Wright High School was pressed into service. Holding 1,400 students, the school was considered a model of architectural ingenuity. The school itself was designed from the inside out. An ideal interior plan was developed before any exterior plans began. The new Luther L. Wright High School was built for the exorbitant sum of $800,000. The high school stands today as a testimony to brilliant architecture, having graduated close to 15,000 students. By 1932, Luther L. Wright High School would hold a junior college on the third floor.
And that building reflects a lot of the innovation that was in the man, Luther L. Wright. The way the library is situated away from the gymnasium, so the sound won't carry, okay? And that, that the library is something that you're automatically going to find no matter where you're at in the building. These were all very well thought out, and in some ways are a reflection of the man, Luther L. Wright.
Other new school buildings were to be added to the school system to meet the needs of the growing population. In 1913, a fire destroyed the old Central School. In its place, the new Central Elementary School would be built, having a capacity of 1,000 students. By 1917, the A. Lanphier Norrie School would be built, with a capacity for another 1,000. And 3 years later, the city of Ironwood would construct the Newport School, which could hold another 1,000 pupils. Ironwood was thrust into war for the first time in 1898. The Spanish-American War would involve some 90 of Ironwood's young volunteers. On April 30th, 1898, Company H would march for the front in Santiago. By September 8th, the soldiers were home.
While it was a great pleasure to see the boys once more, it was not the most pleasant sight in the world. To be sure, we expected to see sickness and pain, but we were not prepared for the sight that greeted us. It almost seemed impossible that this group of weak, emaciated, and suffering invalids could be the remnants of the robust, healthy company volunteers which left Ironwood only 4 months ago. While the Norrie Band played Home Sweet Home, it was not a gala occasion. The cheers melted as the tottering invalids were assisted from the train and greeted by mothers and fathers and relatives with tears and sobs. Ironwood Times, September 10th, 1889.
"1917 saw men being mustered into the service again. Ironwood would send its share of sons to the conflict in Europe. On April 13, 1917, the first group of volunteers would leave for the Eastern Front. Ironwood men would serve distinguishedly and bravely. On October 23, 1917, 2 Ironwood men, Adam Blaziskowski and John Kochanski, would be the two American soldiers to capture the first German prisoner of World War I. But war was also waged on the home front. The miners' union grew increasingly stronger. Any threats of strike were met with extreme resistance as union leaders were arrested. Union meetings were quickly disbanded by police wielding axes and clubs. The press of the area also made its feelings known.
Every loyal American citizen well understands that the World War is seeking to paralyze the industries of the United States. The agitators are not working for the betterment of the miners. They are simply earning money paid by agents of Germany. It is the duty of every good American citizen to stand against these agents of the Kaiser. Any agitator who closes an iron mine aims a blow at our boy and at your boy. Montreal River Miner, 1917.
By September 1st, 1917, 36 Union men would be arrested on charges of conspiracy. None would be convicted. In November of 1918, victory would be declared. Ironwood's sons would be coming home. Over 300 had served in the Great World War, and 31 had died. 1939 saw Nazi Germany invade Poland. The buildup of arms and munitions by the United States led the way for another boom on the Gogebic Range. Production was once again stepped up to meet the demands of the United States war machine gearing for the inevitable. America was once again at war. On the home front, recycling and rationing became a way of life. Over the next 4 years, the war would call Ironwood's young men to participate in the European and Asian theaters. Over 600 would answer the call to duty, and 115 would not come home. By 1975, Korea and Vietnam would place another 10 names of Ironwood sons on the Veterans Memorial. (1919) saw other changes take place on the Gogebic. Prohibition was in. Booze was out, at least officially. Ironwood and its neighboring town of Hurley were peopled by rugged mining and lumbermen with money in their pockets. Even Prohibition was unable to stop the flow of beer and bathtub gin. Numerous raids organized by federal agents shut down what owners would call their soda pop parlors. As soon as the federal agents were gone, the soda pop parlors were back in business. More than 11 inches of rain fell on the Gogebic the week of Friday, September 24th, 1926. 3 electricians, Tom Rowell, Aver Gustafson, and Gustav Sell, rode the cage to the 3rd level, some 300 feet below surface. Rock between the 2nd and 3rd levels broke loose, pounding the cage. At 11:35 a.m., the hoist operator felt the cable go slack. The cage carrying the 3 men jumped the inclined track, pounding the walls of G-shaft as it fell, collapsing the mouths of drift after drift. Free-falling 2,300 feet, the cage hit bottom, instantly killing the 3 men. 43 men were unaccounted for and were somewhere in the mine. The event drew national attention as newspapermen from all over the country converged on the little mining town to witness the worst mine disaster of the century. Within hours, a new cage was fitted on the head frame and sent down G-shaft for exploration, stopping at the 2nd level where the shaft was collapsed. It was everyone's hope the G-shaft was not completely caved and the 43 men were still alive. 727 feet below the surface, 40 men were trapped in the 1,000-foot drift of the 8th level. 3 other men were on lower levels and soon joined the others by climbing the ladder in the shaft. Shift boss Tom Trewartha quickly took charge of the men and organized food for rationing. The men uprooted tram rails and ties to shore the roof of the 8th level, preventing another possible cave-in. By Saturday morning, the food was gone, and the men's carbide lamps had given out, leaving them in total darkness. A crew was sent down the 8th shaft of the Pabst. These two shafts were interconnected on the 26th level. The crew found the crumpled cage of the G shaft, heavily buried in rock. The trapped miners made small pans and burners out of tobacco tins, using kerosene from tram lamps as fuel. The lamps gave heat and dim light. The men stripped birch bark from shoring timbers to make a crude tea. This would be their only food for 5 days. The rescue team used shovels and torches to dismantle the cage and extract the bodies of the 3 electricians. The shaft above was severely damaged and provided no hope of ascending from the 26th level. According to shift duty records, the 43 missing miners should be located between the 8th and 13th levels. It was decided by mine engineers that the safest and most efficient way was to begin working from the bottom up. The 24th level was connected to the 8th shaft. Rescue crews began digging up from there. On Sunday, blasting began, clearing away debris in the raises between the drifts. The work was slow. Every raise had to be shored with timber to prevent further cave-ins. The 43 miners trapped on the 8th level could hear the blasting shots as they rumbled in the drift. They immediately began banging out 8 taps on a pipe with a tram spike, signaling they were on the 8th level. At 4:45 p.m. on Monday afternoon, a shaft repair crew working 300 feet down G shaft could hear 8 faint taps on a pipe. The town of Ironwood was ecstatic. The taps gave indication that men were on the 8th level, and at least some were alive. By Monday afternoon, mining engineers around the world offered their assistance. Specialists came by train to assist in the rescue effort. Tom Michael, blasting expert from DuPont, John Daly, drilling expert from Ingersoll Rand, and George Hawes, safety expert from Chicago. The public funeral for the 3 electricians was held at the auditorium of the municipal building. 4,000 people attended. The rescue effort had now split into 3 different attempts. The lower rescue effort, digging up from the 24th level, was now headed by George Hawes. Another attempt was taking place from the F shaft of the Aurora mine, digging a tunnel to G shaft across 400 feet of rock. The third was an attempt to drill a hole down to the trapped men. The hole would supply food, water, and communications if other attempts failed. The drilling of a 400-foot hole would not commence for 3 days. A 27-foot tunnel had to be dug upwards from the 2nd level before a diamond drill could be installed. By Tuesday afternoon, the lower rescue crew had made their way to the 21st level, hoping to find G shaft open above, but the shaft was still full of rock. An abandoned raise to the 20th level had to be cleared. By Wednesday morning, the abandoned raise was blasted and cleared. The shaft was clear from the 20th level up. Climbing the ladder in G shaft, George Hawes, Oscar Olson, chief engineer of the Oliver Mining Company, Gust Eriksson, superintendent of mines, and Harry Byrne, mine engineer, had made their way up G shaft to the 13th level. Hawes tapped on a pipe 13 times. Moments later, a reply of 8 taps could be heard. By noon on Wednesday, Hawes and the other 3 climbed the 1,000-foot ladder to the 8th level. There, they were greeted by Tom Trewartha. The other men were 1,000 feet back in the drift, asleep. Trewartha guided the 4-man rescue team to the back of the drift, where they were greeted by cries, hugs, and back-pounding. They all shared a cigar that Hawes had brought along for the trip. Word was out that all 43 men were found alive, safe and unharmed. Dr. McKenney made the same rigorous climb as the rescue crew, bringing with him brandy-laced coffee, food, water, and enough cigarettes for everyone. By 3 p.m., the men were pronounced fit enough for the climb down to the 24th level. Extra precautions were taken to keep the weakened men from further disaster. Every man was secured by ropes at each successive ladderway. At 9:22 in the evening, Sam Sinkelma was the first of the trapped miners to step out of the cage, greeted by the flashes of cameras and the cheers of 7,000 people who had gathered to watch this extraordinary rescue. Tom Trewartha, weak from lack of food and lack of sleep, had to be lowered part of the way in a makeshift bucket, but refused to be carried out of the mine. By 12:15 a.m., Thursday, all 43 men were out. Trewartha, along with others, were awarded medals of bravery by the Mining Institute.
So after this accident, after this disaster was absolved, after they rescued these 43 trapped miners, there were calls for not only an inquest, but a full-fledged investigation, a federal investigation, okay? And what they said is essentially that the company knew that this was an accident waiting to happen. And then later on, you saw programs, not that long after the Pabst Mine disaster, programs like Safety First. A lot of things happened in mining methods that ensured that a lot of these disasters weren't going to happen again. So it really put into play, it put into motion a lot of safety practices that probably wouldn't have come about until much later on.
In 1923 saw the closing of the Colby in Bessemer, the first shipping iron mine on the range. By 1926, the Ashland mine, then operated by Cleveland Cliffs, was closed. The first find of nori and wood produced for 42 years, giving 8 million tons of iron ore, leaving an indelible mark on the landscape of ironwood. By 1932, the great Nori Properties, long the #1 producer of ore on the range, had slipped, giving the title of #1 to the Montreal mine in Wisconsin. In 1935, the Nori mine, after producing 56 million tons of iron ore, would close. In the same year, the Aurora and the Pabst would follow the Nori's lead and cease operations, putting 2,000 men out of work. '37 saw a small recovery for ironwood. The East Nori and the Aurora mines were reopened by Republic Steel under the name of the Pinocchi. World War II created a high demand for ore, and once again, ironwood was saved. The population of ironwood was steadily decreasing, though. Families moved to areas of high employment. By 1946, the war was over. Imported ore was beginning to affect the market. By 1965, 45% of all iron ore used in the United States was imported. After almost 70 years of booms and depressions, ironwood could no longer compete and would never recover again. The message was the same throughout the Gogebic. 1950 saw the Eureka close. 1955, the Plymouth. 58, the Wakefield. 61, the Sunday Lake mine. 62, the Pinocchi and the Montreal would close forever. By 1963, the Newport, after 77 years and 37 million tons of iron ore, would close its shafts. 1965 saw the same fate for the Geneva and Carey mines, and in 1966, the Peterson in Bessemer, the last operating mine on the great Gogebic Iron Range would cease operations. The era of the great Gogebic Iron Mine was dead. The political influence of the iron mining companies early in the century left Ironwood and other range communities without an industrial backbone. Any avenues of economic diversity were quickly stifled by the iron mines, creating and controlling these towns specifically for themselves. The range communities would sink into an economic depression that would continue far into the 90s. Ironwood was left with virtually nothing as family after family moved to find work. The exodus has left Ironwood with a population of 6,500, the lowest it's been since 1887. The landscape of Ironwood has been forever changed. The once giant head frames that dominated the skyline are all gone. Where the head frame of the great Norrie once stood, at one time in history, the greatest producer of iron ore in the world, a pile of concrete rubble is all that remains. At the H shaft of the Pabst mine, where almost 70 years ago 7,000 people gathered to pray for the lives of 43 men, now only a capped shaft and unmarked fence remain. Nothing would indicate the hub of activity that took place early in the century. A few weather-beaten boarding houses and old schools remain. Skeletons of old mine buildings and their foundations speckle the landscape. The great caves of the Ashland, Norrie, Aurora, and Pabst mines, created by age and collapsing drifts, are the only indication of a huge underground vein of ore. You will find no marker honoring the 1,000 men who lost their lives in these mines so that we could have railroads, ships, weapons, and peace. Fences guard the concrete capped shafts of the great mines of Ironwood. They remain quietly hidden, unmarked, and long forgotten.